Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this new event organized by the Aberdeen Italian Circle. I'm delighted to be here this evening and introduce you to Gavin Bell. Gavin Bell is the Vice President of our circle. Now, our members and the people, the extended audience that joined our in-person events before the pandemic will be acquainted with Gavin. And we'll know already that he has contributed in many different ways to the life of our circle. But I can tell you, for those of you that don't know him, that he has presented many times before for us, and his illustrated talks were always very well received. So we are looking forward tonight to hear all about the other Norman conquest. So I will just ask you now to keep your microphones muted. There will be an opportunity for everyone to ask questions at the end using the chat function. And if we manage to do so in an orderly manner, we can also unmute the microphones at the end so that you can have an interaction with our presenter. So Gavin, if you are ready, we are ready. You can share your screen at any time.
Right, let's hope that's working. Buonasera a tutti, and thank you for joining me on Zoom this evening. I'm sure that, like me, you learned all about 1066 and the Battle of Hastings at school. But I suspect that, again, like me, you didn't learn about the other Norman conquest that was taking place at almost the same time, but 1,000 miles away. This was, of course, the conquest of Sicily. I can't recall when I first heard about the Normans in Sicily, and my initial information on the subject was fragmentary, consisting of odd, disconnected references in other histories. And having also vaguely gathered that the Normans were so called because they were men from the north, that's to say Vikings, I had visions of fleets of longships sailing past the Rock of Gibraltar on their way to attack Palermo, which of course is not what happened, because even if the Normans had been tempted to emulate the maritime feats of their ancestors, they would quickly have discovered that the Western Mediterranean was firmly in the grip of what were then called the Saracens. That is, the Islamic forces, which had extended their rule over all of North Africa, most of Spain, and all the islands. So if they didn't arrive by sea, how did the Normans get to Sicily? And what on earth possessed them to go seeking conquests so far afield? Well, the answer to the first question, obviously, is they got there over land. But as to why? Well, it turns out that they conquered Sicily, in effect, by accident, as the result of a culmination of a series of coincidences, happy chances, and unexpected consequences. As recent converts to Christianity, the Normans had enthusiastically adopted one of the customs of their new religion, namely pilgrimage. And as luck would have it, there was one major pilgrimage shrine on their doorstep. This was, of course, Le Mont Saint-Michel, which, as well as being just next door, was dedicated to St. Michael the Archangel, a suitable martial patron saint for a nation of warriors, who is generally represented spearing either a dragon, as here, or the devil himself. Bear St. Michael in mind. He crops up again later in the story. But Le Mont Saint-Michel was no more than a hop, skip, and a jump from home. A weekend break to the seaside was scarcely enough to satisfy either their piety or their wanderlust. So many Normans went on pilgrimage further afield, following a well-trodden path which passed the eastern flank of their domains, namely the Via Francigena, which leads over the Alps and halfway down Italy to the Eternal City, where there are no fewer than 7 major pilgrimage basilicas, which would have satisfied many pilgrims. But having ticked Rome off their bucket list, some of the Normans decided to strike out for the ultimate pilgrimage site, namely Jerusalem, following a southern extension of the Via Francigena, which led over the Apennines to the Adriatic ports, where they could take ship for the onward journey. But as well as the main route to Bari, Brindisi, and the other ports, there is a spur leading off, not to a port, but to Monte Sant'Angelo, which is another place of pilgrimage. And the Sant'Angelo of its name is none other than Saint Michael the Archangel, the Normans' patron saint. So they generally stopped off there as well. And it was at or near this shrine that a chance meeting started the process which led ultimately to the Normans' Sicilian adventure. It is recorded that around 1015 AD, a group of Norman pilgrims were buttonholed by a local resident who, knowing their warlike heritage, was keen to put a proposition to them. At this date, Italy was a battleground. This map gives a greatly simplified view of the situation, but does allow us to locate 2 of the main actors. The various themes, Lombardy, Calabria, Dalmatia, these were outposts of the Byzantine Empire, based in Constantinople, while the duchies of Benevento and Salerno were in the hands of the Lombards, who had earlier conquered much of northern Italy and had now extended their influence further south. The Norman pilgrim's new acquaintance represented the Lombard faction, and he wanted to sign the pilgrims up as mercenaries. They apologized that they had not come equipped for fighting, but promised that as soon as they got back home, they would recruit some more of their compatriots and would return to Puglia the following season, suitably accoutred for war, which they then did. But in the time-honored fashion of mercenaries, they remained open to all offers, and when the Byzantines came up with a better offer, they were happy to change sides. And this continued until the fateful day in the year 1030, when the Duke of Naples, the latest of their paymasters, found himself a bit strapped for cash and offered them the lordship of the county of Aversa instead. At which point the Normans realized that instead of fighting other people's wars, they could just as well enter the fray on their own account, which they then proceeded to do with some success. We don't know the names of all the Normans who took part in the adventure, but one particular Norman family became predominant, namely the de Hauteville, or Altavilla, as they were known in Italy. Tancred de Hauteville was a fecund but impoverished knight from the bottom of the Cherbourg Peninsula in western Normandy, and as there was little he could offer them in the way of lands, no fewer than 8 out of his 12 sons made their way to southern Italy to seek their fortunes. The first of these to achieve prominence was William. Before the Saracens had taken over Sicily, it had formed part of the Byzantine Empire, and in 1038, the Emperor Michael IV made an attempt to reconquer the island, sending his most successful general, one George Maniaces, at the head of an invasion force which included a Norman contingent, led by William de Hauteville, then the eldest of the clan. Here we see the Christians landing from their galleys, advancing on the Saracens, who are lying dead in heaps or running away, retreating in panic. William showed himself to be a worthy descendant of his berserker forebears by reportedly decapitating at a single blow the Emir of Syracuse, an exploit which earned him the byname of Bras de Fer, and which is regularly reprised in the Teatro dei Pupi. But before William could indulge in any more mayhem, the expedition to Sicily was recalled when General Maniakes fell foul of palace intrigues back in Constantinople. William Barras de Fer died in 1046, and leadership of the de Hauteville then devolved on his brother Robin, who was a very different character. He too gained a nickname, but his was Guiscard, meaning cunning, and he went about matters in a much more subtle fashion than William. The Normans had by now largely defeated both the Byzantines and the Lombards, but Robert now had to face a new adversary in the shape of the Pope. The papacy at this date was in a position of some weakness. The Pope's spiritual authority was challenged by Constantinople, and on the temporal front, powerful neighbours hedged him in. To compensate, the papacy sought help from a bit of fake news in the shape of a document known as the Donation of Constantine. According to this, when the Roman Emperor Constantine adopted Christianity and moved the imperial capital to Constantinople, he made a gift to the papacy of the temporal overlordship of his western domains. This donation was proved some centuries later to be a complete fiction, but at the time it was not challenged, and it was taken by Pope Leo IX as his excuse to assert what he saw as his rights over these Normans, who were really getting altogether too uppity. Unfortunately, his supposed allies, the Byzantines, left him in the lurch, and the papal army was defeated at the Battle of Civitate in 1053, the Pope himself falling into the hands of the victorious Normans. They treated him with exaggerated courtesy, but did not release him until he had agreed to acknowledge their possession of the lands they had conquered. And just a few years later, the Normans changed allegiance yet again, now supporting the papacy, this time in the person of Pope Nicholas II against the Holy Roman Emperor. The Normans got their reward at the Synod of Melfi in 1059, when Nicholas reconfirmed Robert as Duke of Puglia, Calabria, and somewhat cynically, it has to be said, of Sicily, which had been under Saracen rule for 2 centuries. By the early 1000s, Islam had lost much of its initial momentum and was riven by a range of disputes, ethnic, dynastic, and doctrinal, all of which were reflected in Sicily. There were also on the island significant Christian and Jewish minorities who, while they had come to an accommodation with their Muslim conquerors, might still welcome release from their domination. In 1066, Duke William of Normandy, by defeating and killing King Harold, effectively conquered England in a day. Sicily, on the other hand, took a little longer. The first reason for this was the limited size of the invading force. To most of the Normans and their allies in southern Italy, Sicily was no more than a sideshow. They preferred to seek bigger rewards on the mainland or even in the Byzantine lands beyond the Adriatic. So the Normans who invaded Sicily never numbered more than a few hundred. Secondly, there was no longer a single emir in overall control of the island, which had instead split into a number of warring fiefdoms, each of which had to be separately dealt with. After a modest start in the northeast corner of the island, in the early 1060s, the Normans took the capital, Palermo, in 1072, an event which is here commemorated in the decoration of a traditional carretto. After Palermo had been taken, Robert departed to deal first with problems in Puglia, and then in seeking to extend his conquests into the Byzantine provinces in what are now Albania and Greece, where, ironically, he died in 1085, leaving Roger, the youngest of the de Hauteville brothers, in sole command in Sicily. And this is another of the happy accidents in the story, as he turned out to be just the man for the job. His upbringing during the Norman takeover of southern Italy had taught him all about warfare, but also the arts of cajolery, arm twisting, and negotiation. Sometimes he allied himself with local warlords, playing off one against another, but often he managed bloodless takeovers, confirming a degree of local autonomy to towns or leaders who would acknowledge his overall sovereignty. After decades of anarchy, excuse me, anarchy and misrule, as the various Muslim factions had fought for supremacy, the bulk of the Sicilians were probably quite happy to accept any leader who would keep the peace. Now, as every schoolboy knows, one institution the Normans brought to England was the feudal system. On the Italian mainland, Roger would have seen how this same feudal system, on paper so logical, rapidly broke down when the middle managers, the barons and knights, got too big for their boots and made trouble for the king or duke at the top of the pyramid. On the other side, he would have seen how both the Muslim Caliphate and the Byzantine Empire operated on a much flatter and more autocratic model, with most individual estates being held directly by the ruler. And this is the system which he adopted in Sicily. In fact, he had a three-way balancing act to perform between three quite different constituencies, identifiable by the languages they spoke. The largest group were the Arabic-speaking Muslims, followed in numbers by the Greek-speaking Byzantine Christians in the east of the island. And in the wake of the invasion force, there was a growing minority of Roman Catholic settlers speaking some form of Romance language. Part of Roger's strategy to keep these different groups happy took the form of bricks and mortar. On the island of Lipari, for example, he established the Catholic monastery of San Bartolomeo, but balanced this with assistance to the Byzantine or Orthodox congregations by helping build or restore some of their places of worship and monasteries. There's no record of him building or repairing any mosques, but he did allow the Muslims to continue practicing their faith. And this ritual bathhouse at Cefaladiana, south of Palermo, actually stands in the shadow of a Norman fort and is thought to be of similar date. In fact, in his dealings with the Muslims, Robert simply adapted the system under which the Muslims had hitherto accommodated the Christians and the Jews in their midst, provided they lived peaceably and paid an additional but not overburdensome tax. They were allowed to retain a considerable degree of local autonomy, which included retention of their own Sharia courts, provided that they acknowledged his overall authority. Roger also made efforts to integrate the non-Catholic populations into the state, recruiting his naval forces from the Greek Byzantine community and employing Arabs in his civil service. Norman French, Latin, Greek, and Arabic were all recognized as official languages. The result was a heterogeneous but essentially peaceful domain. Roger died in 1101, but by the time of his death, he had so effectively pacified the island that while his son and heir was only 8 years old, his widow was able to rule as regent until the boy came of age and could take over the reins as Count Roger II. Apart from Sicily, Roger II also inherited the Dukedom of Calabria, but until 1127, Puglia, the third of the Hauteville duchies, was separately ruled. In that year, Duke William of Puglia died without issue, and Roger led a force there to lay his claim. Once again, there was opposition from the papacy, this time in the person of Pope Honorius II, but following what was by now becoming a well-worn precedent, Honorius's forces were defeated and he recognized Roger as Duke of Puglia. Not long after this, Honorius died and there was a disputed succession, the two candidates for the papal chair representing rival Roman factions. Of the two, Anacletus had the better claim to have been legitimately elected, but in the long run, Innocent had the big battalions behind him, in particular the Holy Roman Emperor. So he is the one who has gone down in history as the rightful successor to the throne of St. Peter, while Anacletus, of whom there appears to be no portrait in existence, is demoted to the status of antipope. But it was some little while before Innocent triumphed, and in the meantime, in his search for allies, Anacletus sought the support of Roger II, and in return promoted him to be king of Calabria, Puglia, and Sicilia. And when Anacletus died and Innocent became undisputed pope, he found it politic to confirm Roger's kingship. Having established himself firmly over the three former duchies, Roger now entered on what must be regarded as the golden age of Norman rule in Sicily. A golden age, firstly, in that it represented a continued period of peace and prosperity in the island for all of its constituent peoples, but also in terms of the cultural artifacts which have survived. Foremost among these must count the various churches which were built during Roger's reign. The first of these is the Cathedral of Cefalu, built to fulfill a pledge made by Roger when he survived a storm. 4 square, not to say fortress-like on the outside, internally it conceals one of the finest examples anywhere of Byzantine mosaic art, culminating in this magnificent image of Christ Pantocrator. But while the Christ image is pure Byzantine, the captions to the image are in an untidy mixture of Greek and Latin. But if the Cathedral of Cefalu was deliberately aiming to appeal to both Greek and Latin Christians, the Church of the Maftarana in Palermo goes one better. Both the fabric and the name of this church have undergone major change, but the clue to its origins are in the left-hand side in this view. This was built not by the king, but by George of Antioch, who served Roger first as general and admiral, hence the church's original name of Santa Maria del Ammiraglio, and latterly as chief minister. As his name hints, George was born in Syria and belonged to the Byzantine or Orthodox Church. And before entering Roger's service, he had been employed by the Muslim rulers of what is now Tunisia. So it really is no surprise that his church illustrates the heterogeneous nature of the Kingdom of Sicily. While it has been much modified, the core of the Maftarana is still recognizable as being a church on the Greek model, that is, in the form of a cross with equal short arms beneath a dome decorated with Byzantine mosaics. And it houses 2 other significant images which also reflect the multicultural nature of the new kingdom. The first is a portrait of King Roger II, which in an image derived from Byzantine traditions shows him being crowned by Christ. The oddity is that while Roger is identified by an inscription using Greek letters, the wording is actually Latin. It reads Rogerius Rex, Roger the King. But the most surprising thing in this most ecumenical of churches is this Arabic inscription on a pillar near the entrance. It does not actually say anything that offends against Christian belief, but surprisingly, it starts with the words of the Basmala, which precedes all Muslim prayers and all chapters in the Quran, in the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. This reflects an openness to Islam and the Arab world on the part of the Norman rulers of Sicily, which represents a major divergence from attitudes in the rest of Europe. The establishment of Norman rule in Sicily coincided closely with the start of the Crusades, but none of the de Hauteville ever went on crusade. On the contrary, they maintained diplomatic relations with Islamic rulers and gave encouragement to Muslim writers and scientists. Among these was the cartographer al-Idrisi, from whom Roger commissioned a world map and gazetteer in Arabic. This was compiled over 15 years, in part from earlier sources, but also by taking reports and interviews from as many seafarers and travellers as he could find. The result appeared in the last days of Roger's reign with the Arabic title of Al-Kitab al-Rujari, or the Book of Roger. Along with descriptions of all parts of the then known world, and which starts by stating that the world is a sphere with a circumference of 23,000 miles, not a bad estimate for the time. This was accompanied by a world map, which was in advance of anything produced in Western Europe until the time of the Portuguese navigators and the cartographers of the Low Countries. We now know that the world looks a little different from how El-Idrisi drew it, but we can recognize most of the Eurasian landmass. Distances and shapes are inaccurate, but topologically speaking, Al-Idrisi has managed to get most of the lands and seas in the correct relation to each other. And in familiar places, the detail is not far out. Here, for example, is Sicily. The place names are indicated using the Latin alphabet, but including some Arabic terms. For instance, Etna and Stromboli are labeled as Jebel al-Nar, or Mountain of Fire. But the greatest of the monuments left by Roger is the Capella Palatina, which, as its name suggests, was the private chapel within the royal palace, although it did double duty as an audience chamber. And it illustrates to perfection the blend of Catholic, Orthodox, and Muslim imagery, which symbolize his regime. Like the Cathedral of Cefalu, this uses the Latin ground plan of a long nave with aisles and transepts, but it's overwhelmingly decorated with mosaics. The earliest of these are all Byzantine in subject and execution, with images of saints of the Orthodox Church, and not one, but two images of Christ Pantocrator, the quintessentially Orthodox element. But while it is clearly an ecclesiastical space, its dual use as an audience chamber for this multicultural kingdom goes some way to accounting for its most surprising feature, which is an Islamic stalactite roof, which would not look out of place in the Alhambra. The blend of these three languages, nations, and religions is further illustrated by a remarkable document which was created for use in the Capella. This is the Harley Psalter, a trilingual edition of the Psalms of David in Greek, Latin, and Arabic. The Capella would originally have been richly draped in silk hangings produced by Arabic craftsmen. Nothing now remains of the fixed hangings, but an example of the textiles produced by the Royal Embroidery Workshop has been preserved in the shape of Roger's ceremonial cloak, which, thanks to a quirk of history, found its way to Vienna, where it has been carefully preserved ever since. Roger died in 1154 and was entombed in this rich porphyry sarcophagus in Palermo Cathedral. Roger was succeeded by his younger son, William, whose reign certainly did not start well. On his accession, he was called on quite suddenly to deal with issues which had been festering for some time and which only Roger II's charisma had thus far managed to keep from erupting. The problem lay with the Norman or Latin section of the population, who felt they were not getting a fair crack of the whip and who resented the power held by Muslims and Orthodox Christians at court. This first manifested itself in the form of a revolt in the mainland part of the kingdom, supported by an unlikely alliance of the Byzantine Emperor and the Pope. William's problems were compounded by his being seriously ill when the revolt broke out, and as a result, the insurgents and their allies made extensive gains, taking control of much of Puglia. But when he recovered, William took vigorous action, reconquering all of the territory lost and adding yet another scalp to the de Hauteville's impressive tally of discomfited papal adversaries, this time in the form of Pope Hadrian IV, otherwise known as Nicholas Breakspere, the only English pope, who, in view of the growing menace he faced from Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, decided that, on balance, he would be better off with William and the proven military power of Sicily on the inside of the tent. So not only was William confirmed in his tenure of Puglia and Calabria, but also much of Campania was added to his possessions. And no sooner had he returned victorious than William had to face another revolt by disaffected barons in Palermo, who resented the power held by some of the king's officials, many of whom were Muslim. Once again, however, he emerged victorious, but relations with the Muslim community were badly damaged. One criticism which can reasonably be levelled at William was that, while he could rouse himself to decisive action when needed, he was by nature indolent, spending much of his time relaxing with his paramours in a series of palaces around Palermo. The best preserved of these is La Sisa, now marooned in the suburbs, but originally surrounded by extensive water gardens in the Islamic style. This alcove, which opens out onto the garden site, is complete with water slide and rill and would not look out of place in the Alhambra. Alone among the de Hauteville rulers of Sicily, William built no churches. He did, however, add to the decoration of the Capella Palatina in a way that reflected changing power structures. In place of the early, essentially static Byzantine images, the mosaics added at the sides of the nave are narratives in the form of a continuous strip cartoon with scenes from the lives of St. Paul and St. Peter. On the left, we see the unredeemed Saulus falling, blinded by the light, with God in a vignette above saying, "Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me?" And on the right, he is being baptized as Paul. And on the opposite wall, we have the apocryphal account of Peter and Paul meeting in Rome and appearing before Nero. Why are these images so significant? Well, as we've seen, King William's father and grandfather had been at great pains to maintain a balance between the different ethnic and religious constituencies of the kingdom, and in particular to prevent the establishment of the sort of feudal system which had caused such trouble in Puglia and Calabria. So the prominent depiction of Saints Peter and Paul, both by virtue of their martyrdom, closely associated with the Church of Rome, indicates a shift in this balance at the expense of the Orthodox and Islamic communities towards the Catholic and feudal party, and this foreshadows significant events in the time of William's successors. William I died in 1166. Unfriendly chroniclers later saddled him with the label William the Bad, which is probably unjustified. He certainly lacked the diplomatic skills of his father, King Roger, but under his rule, the kingdom reached its greatest geographical extent, including all of the Italian peninsula south of Naples, and he did, just about, manage to keep the lid on the feudal resurgence among the barons. In one respect, William followed his grandfather's precedent by leaving as heir an underage son for whom his mother had to act as regent. But circumstances had changed, and Margaret, the Queen Dowager, faced an almost impossible task to protect herself and her son from the machinations of the resurgent feudalists, and did not help matters by parachuting in a cousin from Normandy to be her chief advisor, her chancellor, her archbishop, and, it was widely rumoured, her lover. So when William II took over as ruler in his own right in 1171, he had to face an entranced feudalist opposition. If his father was unfairly tagged as William the Bad, William the Second's sobriquet of William the Good is perhaps no more justified. On the plus side, once the upheavals of the Regency were over, his reign coincided with a period of peace and prosperity within Sicily, and he was personally a less abrasive character than his father. But he made serious errors, whose effects only became apparent after his death. A king obviously needs an heir, and if he has to have an heir, he needs a queen. And as William represented a considerable catch, there were proposals for betrothal even before the end of his minority. The first of these came in 1168, with the proposal of marriage to Joanna, daughter of King Henry II of England, who, thanks to the dowry of his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was also ruler over much of northern and western France. Here we see the royal couple as gisants, or recumbent tomb figures, ironically united in death at the Abbey of Fontevraud, as they most assuredly were not in life. But in 1170, before anything could be agreed, Thomas Becket was murdered at Canterbury, supposedly at Henry's behest. Henry was excommunicated, and the plan of marriage to his daughter was quickly shelved. There then followed negotiations with the Byzantine Emperor Manuel for the hand in marriage of his daughter Maria. Agreement was seemingly reached, but on the appointed day of betrothal in 1172, Maria simply failed to turn up, and no explanation was ever forthcoming from the Byzantines as to why. For the time being, William abandoned his search for a bride and diverted his attention into a project which, while it has left us a magnificent artistic monument, was one which turned out to be one of his biggest mistakes. This was the foundation of the Abbey of Monreale, just 6 miles outside Palermo. Various explanations for this project have been put forward, including straightforward piety, a wish to outshine his ancestors' efforts at Cefalu and the Capella Palatina, and an attempt to counter the influence of the Archbishop of Palermo, a leading light of the feudalist party. To us, Monreale does not immediately appear to be a mistake. It is one of the finest ecclesiastical monuments of 12th century Europe, resplendent in mosaics, including, of course, the inevitable Christ Pantocrator, serried ranks of saints, both Greek and Latin, Bible stories in bronze on the doors, and in stone on the capitals in the cloister. But while Monreale is undoubtedly magnificent and gave William a counterweight to the influence of Archbishop Walter, ecclesiastical bling on this scale did not come cheap, and the manner of its financing had unfortunate consequences. Much of the western half of Sicily was still populated by Muslims in estates held directly by the crown, who had always administered them with a light touch. But in order to fund the building of Monreale, William II transferred many of these estates to the new foundation of Monreale, and the abbots would prove rather less accommodating overlords than the kings, and this led ultimately to disaffection and revolt among the Muslims. By 1176, William's marriage prospects were looking up once more. Henry II of England had done penance for his supposed part, for his supposed part in the murder of Thomas Becket, and had been received back into the fold of the church. So the project for his daughter Joanna to marry William was revived, the marriage eventually taking place in 1177. An interesting footnote to this is found among the mosaics at Monreale. Among the throng of long-established saints who cover the walls of the nave is this, Sanctus Thomas Cantuar, one of the earliest representations of the newly canonized Thomas Becket. William's next big mistake would lead to the extinction of the de Hauteville royal house. While William's wife, Joanna, had been very young at the time of her marriage, she was, by 1184, definitely of childbearing age, but no child had been born, which makes William's next dynastic alliance hard to comprehend. He had an aunt, Princess Constance, a posthumous daughter of his grandfather Roger, and actually a couple of years younger than William himself. In default of any children of William's, Constance would be heir apparent to the throne. So it is very hard to understand why William then agreed that she should marry Henry, the son and heir of the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. Unless William and Joanna produced a child, then the kingdom would fall into the hands of the Hohenstaufens. And that is precisely what happened. William died childless in 1189, aged just 36. The throne was initially seized by his cousin Tancred, an illegitimate grandson of King Roger II. Tancred had the support of the barons of the feudal party, while Constance, the rightful heir, and her German consort Henry were initially prevented by fighting on the Italian mainland from claiming the throne. But Tancred died in 1194, whereupon Constance and Henry, now confirmed as Holy Roman Emperor, were crowned in Palermo. And this effectively marked the end of the de Hauteville dynasty, barely a century since its foundation by Roger I, the Great Count. The Kingdom of Sicily, of course, survived in various forms until it was swept away by Garibaldi and his red shirts in 1860, but its best days were arguably now past. The short reign of Henry and Constance and the interregnum which followed their deaths were times of upheaval and strife in Sicily, which saw a resurgence of fighting between Christian and Muslim, and peace of a sort was not restored until their infant son came of age. This was Frederick, who became in succession King of Sicily, King of Germany, King of the Romans, Holy Roman Emperor, and even King of Jerusalem. Known to his contemporaries as Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world, he belongs more to the wider history of Europe, in particular the centuries-long struggle for supremacy between the Holy Roman Empire and the papacy. But he left his mark on Sicily by destroying the multicultural kingdom created by the de Hauteville. While personally a man of wide sympathies and learning, and reputedly fluent in Arabic among other languages, Frederick did not share his predecessor's dream of a multicultural state. To him, the Muslims in Sicily had come to represent simply a problem of governance. Latterly, the rebellious Muslims had retreated to a number of fastnesses in the western mountains of Sicily. One of these was Montejato, a windy hilltop southwest of Palermo, where they occupied the ruins of a Greek settlement from before the time of the Saracens. Excavations continue here, led by the University of Innsbruck, but indications suggest that the eventual evacuation of the site by the Muslims was fairly orderly and peaceful. There's no evidence of a struggle or a sudden departure. But however it was achieved, Henry committed what can only be described as an act of ethnic cleansing, whereby the remaining Muslims are forcibly resettled on the southern Italian mainland, principally in the town of Lucera in northern Puglia, where they worked as armourers and formed a reservoir of recruits to the Sicilian armed forces. While Frederick lived, the colony of Lucera thrived. But the Hohenstaufen dynasty did not long survive his death in 1250, and in 1300, under his Angevin successor Charles II of Naples, the Muslims of Lucera were killed, exiled, or enslaved, ending the last remnants of the multicultural, multi-ethnic kingdom established in Sicily 2 centuries early, by a bunch of likely lads from Normandy. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Gavin. Fantastic presentation with wonderful images. So while our audience is warming up for some questions, may I ask you a couple of questions myself? So I'm quite fascinated by William I, the Bard. So why do you think we don't have any portrait of him? Do you think that they were destroyed, or?
I don't know. I went looking for portraits of everyone involved in the story, and I found most of them. I just could not find anything contemporary of William. There are plenty of Victorian Victorian era images purporting to show William, but they're not the real thing.
Of course.
So I don't know. I don't know what the answer is to that.
If they maybe were removed once he fell out of power, you never know.
Possibly, I don't know.
Anything is possible.
Yeah.
Is there anyone who will want to ask a question to Gavin? You can either write it in the chat or unmute yourself if you prefer. Don't be shy. And in the meantime, I can ask you another question. You know, beautiful images, fantastic mosaics. Being an art historian myself, you know, I often come across of buildings or, you know, images, artifacts that were destroyed because of the change of rule. But here, of course, these all the churches and mosaics have survived for hundreds of years. So why do you think they survived there? Do you think that because of the nature of that land, it was a bit of a melting pot of different cultures?
Again, I can't say for sure, but I suspect that after the Hautevils died out and after Frederick II faded from the scene, the center of gravity of the kingdom, I think, shifted towards Naples. And I think Sicily became, in effect, a bit of a backwater. Nobody was interested in it. So what was there was just left to remain there. That's the best theory I can come up with.
Thank you.
Yes. I have a question, Dad.
Yes.
Not sure you're allowed. This is my daughter.
I'll be nice. No, I just wondered how many of the photos in that presentation are your own work from trips you've been on?
Certainly most of the architectural ones and the interiors of the churches and things, these are all mine.
I suspected as much.
Yes.
Can I ask a question?
Sorry, who's talking?
Yeah, it's Dan from Loughborough. Thank you very much. Really enjoyed it. Great presentation. How much did the Normans in Sicily maintain links with the Normans in Normandy? Were they just a completely separate enclave, or they obviously weren't a colony of Normandy? They were completely separate, I guess. Were they, or did they maintain links the whole time?
I don't think they would have seen themselves as a colony of Normandy, but they would have had family connections. I suspect they probably did maintain informal links. I don't think there was any official formal link between the Dukes of Normandy and the Kings of England. But obviously, when it came to the point at the end of the day, there was still some connection. I said that, excuse me, that William II wanted to form a counterweight against the influence of the Archbishop of Palermo. Well, the Archbishop of Palermo has gone down in history with a rather jaw-breaking name, Gualterio of Famiglio, which is the Italian best version of his real name, which was English. He was Walter of the Mill. And there were other people. I think there was another senior cleric in Sicily at the time who was also of English extraction. I think there was probably a certain amount of osmosis between the two. I don't know to what extent this is all documented though.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else who would like to ask something?
May I ask a question, please?
Yes.
You're talking about a period of connection with the East when Venice was playing an increasing role. Was there any serious connection between the Normans in Sicily and the Venetians and their approach to the East?
I don't know that there was anything major. They probably regarded themselves as allies up to a point, in that both Venice and Sicily had at one point been outposts of the Byzantine Empire. Beyond that, I really I couldn't say. I have to emphasize, I'm not an expert in this area. I've always been interested in Sicily since I first went there, which is over 20 years ago. And latterly, all this leisure that I've had, I've been able to do a bit of reading in the background, but I am far from being an expert in it.
Well, thank you for that. And I should have said before that I thoroughly enjoyed what you were telling. Sorry?
Thank you.
No, it was just an additional point on this. As the Hauteville dynasty died out and Frederick came on board, that was just about the point when the Venetians became dominant in the support for the Crusaders in the East. Is there any idea that the Normans were in some way a buffer against the West in the form of Venice and others, protecting the East?
I don't know about protecting, but they certainly, the earlier both the Rogers and William I, none of them showed any inclination to go on crusade. They all maintained relationships with various of the Muslim powers. The principal Muslim power at that date was based in Egypt, but there were also relations with North Africa. The only one of the Hauteville that showed any sign at all of becoming involved in the Crusades was William II. And as I think suggested, I reckon he was a fairly clueless sort of guy. He made mistakes everywhere he went. At the time of his death, he was making preparations to possibly go on crusade. But he died in time to prevent himself making an even greater fool of himself than he had already.
Can I ask a question?
Thank you.
Can I ask a question? Yeah. Following on from what you just said, who was the one who followed Constance and Henry?
Well, Constance and Henry died before the end of the century. And at that date, I think their son Frederick was an infant, and he was put into the guardianship of the Pope. Now, the Pope obviously did not come to Palermo to look after things. I think he sent lieutenants to mind the shop, as it were. I cannot for the life of me remember who they were. I'd need to go and look it up in the books. There was no other king. The king in waiting was Frederick. He was the heir. It's just that he was only about 3 years old at the time.
So who was the main ruler after that?
After Frederick, pass.
Okay.
My detailed interest ends once he fades from the scene. I don't.
Okay. Well, again, thank you. It's very good, very interesting. Thank you.
Certainly before 1300, the power had passed from the Hohenstaufens to the French.
That's the word I wanted. The Hohenstaufens.
Yes. Well, yes. Frederick was Frederick of Hohenstaufen.
Ah.
Right.
So is that Habsburg?
No. Different animal.
No, that's the Holy Roman Empire, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you.
I think
so. Frederick was a Staufen. Okay, yeah.
It was Edward Edwards who wanted to ask something. Am I correct?
I just wondered what part Malta played in this.
I would have to confess that I did not bone up on Malta. Certainly, yes, Malta was at one point ruled from Sicily. I think Malta was cleared by Frederick at the same time as Western Sicily was. I think that's what happened to Malta at the end. But the steps by which it got to that point, I couldn't offhand say. It's in the books, but that's one of the chapters I haven't studied in great detail.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk.
Thank you. Is there anyone else? Otherwise, I think we can say thank you to Gavin for a fantastic talk. Before we say goodbye, I would like to say a couple of things. And first of all, I would like to say that we are going to meet in 2 weeks' time on Thursday, 25th of March at 7:30 p.m. as usual. As you know, the Aberdeen Italian Circle is part of the Società Dante Alighieri. And this year we celebrate the 700th anniversary of the death of the poet Dante Alighieri, from which our society takes the name. So the 25th of March is Dante Day. So we are going to have a special event. We are going to have Professor Jane Everson. Professor Everson is Professor Emerita of Italian Literature at Royal Holloway University of London, and she will present Songs Without Words, the Divina Commedia on the balletic stage. So I do hope that you will join us then. And before we say goodbye, I just also wanted to thank you all for attending. And I wanted to say particularly a big thank you to the people who donated to our page. And in doing so, allow us to continue to broadcast our events for free online. So thank you very much. If you want to know more about our future events, please watch our website, which is aberdeenitaliancircle.org/forward program. And for anyone who wants to donate, you can do so still on our website, aberdeenitaliancircle.org/forward donations. Thank you, Gavin. Thank you, everyone. And see you all in 2 weeks' time. Good night.